He humiliated her without imagining she was a billionaire heiress. The cold CEO begged for her love. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The cold Chicago rain slanted against the plate glass windows of the daily grind, drumming a rhythm that matched the impatient tapping of fingers on a tabletop. Inside, the warm glow of pendant lights reflected in the droplets, creating a cozy atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to Alexandra Scott's mood. "Another espresso, please," she said to a passing waiter, running a hand through her chestnut hair, which was already starting to curl from the humidity despite her careful styling. It was just past 9 in the morning, and she was already 2 coffees deep. Her third interview this week was in an hour, and though Alexandra Warren's resume could have opened doors to practically any architecture firm in Chicago, she had decided to hide her real name, Warren, a name that, in the world of American business, unlocked every opportunity but locked away any chance of proving her own worth. That was why her resume listed her as Alexandra Scott, an architecture graduate from the Illinois Institute of Technology with an impressive but not overwhelming portfolio. No mention of the Warren real estate empire, no gallery photos showing her alongside her father, the most powerful developer in the Midwest. Alexandra traced the rim of her porcelain cup, trying to calm her nerves. For 26 years, she had been accustomed to luxury, but now, sitting in a normal coffee shop, wearing a simple trench coat with her portfolio at her side, she felt more authentic than ever. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" A deep, masculine voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up into a pair of intensely blue eyes. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit was gesturing to the chair opposite her. The cafe was packed, the morning rush of Chicagoans seeking refuge from the rain and caffeine before starting their workday. "No, please," she replied, moving her portfolio aside. The man gave a curt nod of thanks and sat, placing an elegant leather briefcase on the table. Up close, she could see a sharp jawline, short-cropped dark hair, and expensive but discreet cufflinks that glinted with the movement of his hands. He looked to be in his mid-30s and radiated a confidence that made several people at nearby tables glance his way. "Thomas Kowalski," he introduced himself, not offering a handshake, which Alexandra found odd but not unpleasant. He was too busy pulling a laptop from his bag. "Alexandra Scott," she replied. A split-second hesitation fortunately lost on him. He nodded without looking up, his focus entirely on the screen. 6 minutes later, he was still working in silence, and she was flipping through her sketches to prepare for her interview when his phone rang. "Kowalski," he answered, his tone instantly changing. It was sharper, more authoritative. "No, that is absolutely unacceptable. We paid for exclusivity, and now you're telling me you're showing the same design to the Japanese consortium?" His voice remained controlled, but Alexandra heard the steel in it. "You have 24 hours to fix this, or we're pulling out of the deal. And believe me, no one in Chicago will touch you after I'm done with you." A pause followed as Thomas listened to the reply, his expression unreadable. "I don't care. The problem is solved by tomorrow, or the contract is terminated. Goodbye." He hung up and stared into space for a moment, a look of intense dissatisfaction on his face. Alexandra found herself wondering what it must be like to work for someone like that, cold, demanding perfection. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp curse. Thomas was looking in disbelief at his white shirt, now stained with coffee. The waiter, a young kid, maybe a DePaul student, stood beside him, horror painted on his face. I'm so sorry, Mr. Kowalski. I slipped and you decided to empty a pot of coffee on a suit worth more than your monthly salary." Thomas stood up, and his voice, though not raised, cut through the cafe's hum like a knife. "Do you people not hire staff who can hold a tray steady?" The atmosphere in the cafe shifted instantly. Conversations died down. All eyes turned to their table. Alexandra felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, not for herself, but for this arrogant man. "It was an accident," she said quietly, before she could stop herself. Thomas looked at her as if just remembering her presence. "Excuse me? I said it was an accident. It could have happened to anyone." Her voice was calm but firm. The waiter looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and terror. For a moment, Thomas looked surprised by her intervention, but his face quickly hardened into a cool mask. "Ah, I see. You're one of those people who believe incompetence should be rewarded, not criticized," he said with a cynical smile. "Let me enlighten you. In the real world of business, a mistake like this can cost millions. It can destroy a reputation. It can undo years of hard work." Alexandra felt her face burn, this time with anger. She stood up, unconsciously drawing even more attention. "In the real world, Mr. Kowalski, people make mistakes, and true leaders know how to handle them without publicly humiliating people." A complete silence fell over the cafe. A few people exchanged glances. Someone discreetly pulled out a phone, probably to record the scene. "True leaders?" Thomas gave a cold smile. "And I suppose you know all about leadership, Miss Scott," she reminded him coolly, though for a fraction of a second she was tempted to use her real name just to see the shock on his face. "Miss Scott," he repeated with faint amusement. "Then allow me to ask, how many companies do you run? How many employees are on your payroll? What kind of budget do you manage?" Alexandra clenched her fists under the table but held his gaze. "I don't need to run a company to recognize arrogance and disrespect." Thomas let out a short, humorless laugh. "Typical. Everyone's an expert on management until they have to make a tough decision themselves." He shook his head and turned to the waiter, who was frozen in place. "The check and a towel." Then he looked down at Alexandra. "Good luck in your fantasy land where everyone gets a trophy for trying. I'm heading back to reality." He tossed a bill onto the table, far more than the coffee cost, and strode out of the cafe, leaving behind a tense silence and Alexandra trembling with barely controlled fury. Only when the door closed behind him did the cafe fill with noise again, this time much livelier. The waiter approached her hesitantly. "Thank you," he said softly. No one's stood up for me like that." Alexandra managed a small smile, trying to calm her churning emotions. "Don't mention it. Some people just forget what it means to be human." She glanced at her watch, and her heart sank. Her interview was in 40 minutes. She had to go. Leaving a tip, she grabbed her portfolio and headed for the door, feeling the eyes of the other patrons on her. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind wet pavement and the clean smell of the city air. Alexandra took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The confrontation had rattled her, but she couldn't let it affect her interview. Today she had a chance to land a job at one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the country, KWA Architects, and nothing was going to spoil it. She walked toward the L station, straightening her blazer and trying to reclaim her professional composure. It wasn't the first time she'd dealt with arrogant men who thought money gave them the right to treat others like dirt. The irony was, if she used her real name, men like Thomas Kowalski would be falling over themselves to impress her. But that wasn't the point. She wanted to prove she could succeed without her father's name, without the legacy, without the influence of the Warren family. She wanted to earn her place. The train appeared on the elevated tracks, and Alexandra took one more deep breath. Stepping inside the car, she promised herself she would never have to see that insufferable Kowalski again. Chicago was a big city. What were the chances? The offices of KWA Architects were located in a sleek high-rise in the Loop. Alexandra rode the elevator to the 20th floor, admiring the panoramic view of the city. She felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach, but she was determined. After graduating with honors and spending 2 years at a small studio in Portland, where no one knew her family's empire, she was ready for a bigger challenge. The receptionist, a chic woman in her 40s, greeted her with a professional smile. "Good morning, I have an interview. Alexandra Scott." "Good morning, Ms. Scott. Sophia Hayes is expecting you in the conference room right this way." Alexandra followed her through an open-plan office, buzzing with architects bent over computers and scale models. The space pulsed with a creative energy she found intoxicating, exactly what she was looking for. Sophia Hayes, the head of design, turned out to be a warm, confident woman in her 50s, with the sharp eyes of someone who missed no details. "Alexandra, it's a pleasure to meet you," she said with a firm handshake. "Your portfolio is impressive, especially the project revitalizing that old meatpacking plant into a cultural center, a bold vision." "Thank you," Alexandra replied, feeling a surge of confidence. "That was my thesis project. I've always believed that architecture should bridge the past and the future, not erase history." Sophia smiled with approval and began the standard questions about experience, technical skills, and software proficiency. Alexandra answered confidently, showcasing her projects and sketches. The interview was going so well, she had almost forgotten the morning's incident. "There's one more thing," Sophia said finally, studying her with interest. "Why KWA? I'm sure with your skills you could apply to any number of top firms." Alexandra considered for a moment. "I admire your design philosophy, the balance between functionality and aesthetics. Plus," she hesitated, then decided to be honest, "I've heard you give young architects a real chance to grow and influence projects, not just follow orders." Sophia nodded, pleased. "That's true. We believe in fresh perspectives, which is exactly why we're looking for someone for a major new project, the Lakeshore Gateway Business Center. It's a prestigious commission, and we need someone with your aesthetic sensibilities on the team." Alexandra's heart beat faster. It sounded perfect. "I would be honored to be a part of that project," she answered sincerely. "Excellent," Sophia said, standing. "There's just one final meeting with our CEO. He doesn't normally get involved in hiring, but this project is his top priority." Alexandra stood as well, trying to hide a fresh wave of nerves. "Of course, I'm ready." "Then let's go. He should be out of his board meeting by now." They walked down a hallway toward the CEO's office, passing a glass-walled conference room where a team of architects was debating over a massive model. "That's the business center I was telling you about," Sophia explained. "Ambitious project. 5 buildings, office and retail space, all with a focus on sustainable solutions." Alexandra nodded, genuinely fascinated. A project like this would be the perfect start to her career, built on her own merit, without family connections, without privilege. Sophia knocked on the office door and opened it without waiting for a reply. "Thomas, I have the candidate I told you about, Alexandra Scott, a talented young architect, perfect for the Lakeshore Gateway project." Alexandra froze in the doorway. Seated behind the desk was him, Thomas Kowalski, the same arrogant man from the coffee shop, now in a fresh shirt, his cool gaze widening in disbelief as he recognized her. "Miss Scott," he said slowly, his face an unreadable mask. "Mr. Kowalski," she replied just as coolly, feeling all her dreams for this job crumbling before her eyes. Sophia looked between them, confused. "You two know each other?" A tense silence hung in the air as Alexandra and Thomas sized each other up like two boxers in a ring. "We had the pleasure of meeting this morning," Thomas said finally, the corner of his mouth ticking up in a barely perceptible ironic smile. "Under rather interesting circumstances." Alexandra gritted her teeth so hard she almost felt pain. Of all the firms in Chicago, of all the jobs she could have applied for, she had to land here, with the man she had publicly called out just hours ago. "Indeed, the circumstances were enlightening," she retorted, maintaining a professional tone. Sophia glanced between them, sensing the tension, but deciding to push past it. "Wonderful. Then we can get right to it. Alexandra has an impressive portfolio and exactly the fresh perspective we've been looking for on the Gateway project." Thomas never took his eyes off Alexandra, his expression giving nothing away. "Yes, I read her application. Impressive education, interesting projects," he said in a neutral tone, "but I do wonder if Miss Scott can work as part of a team and accept constructive criticism. Those are key skills at our firm." Alexandra felt a flush creep up her neck, but kept her voice steady. "I value constructive criticism, Mr. Kowalski. I emphasize the word constructive. I believe in respecting every member of the team, regardless of their position." Their eyes met, and for a moment something flickered in his. She couldn't tell if it was respect, anger, or simple interest. "A fascinating approach," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "Then tell me, Alexandra, what would you do with the central courtyard in the Gateway project? You saw the model on your way in. What are your first impressions?" It was an unexpected question. A test. Alexandra took a deep breath and let her passion for architecture override her nerves. "I only saw a glimpse, but my impression was that the courtyard is too formal. In a business center like that, people need a space that lets them relax, to detach from the corporate atmosphere. Instead of symmetrical paths and geometric flower beds, I would introduce more organic shapes, create micro-environments, quiet nooks for focused work, open areas for collaboration, perhaps a stream or a small pond as a central feature." She spoke with passion, momentarily forgetting their earlier encounter, focused solely on the architecture. When she finished, there was silence. Sophia was looking at her with clear admiration, but Thomas's face remained unreadable. "An interesting concept," he said finally. "Bold and expensive." "Not as expensive as it might seem," she countered confidently. "Many natural elements, if designed properly, require less maintenance than formal gardens. Plus, there's the added value of employee and client satisfaction. Studies show that nature-inspired spaces increase productivity and creativity." Thomas studied her for a long moment, as if running calculations in his head. Finally, he nodded. "Sophia, give us a moment, please," he said, his eyes still locked on Alexandra. Sophia looked surprised but did as she was told, closing the door behind her. Alexandra stood tall, bracing herself for rejection. After all, he had humiliated her in public, and she had given as good as she got. "Are you aware that I don't normally hire someone who publicly questions my authority?" Thomas asked finally, his voice quiet but intense. "I am," she answered, just as quietly. "And I'll understand if you choose not to hire me because of what happened this morning." Thomas rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "The problem is, your idea for the courtyard is exactly what we've been looking for," he said, without turning around. "A fresh approach, the courage to think differently. And what irritates me most is, you were right." He turned, and his face was a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration. "You were right this morning. I was too hard on that kid. It was just an accident, and I was having a bad day," he admitted, the words clearly costing him. "I hate being wrong, but I also hate ignoring talent when I see it." Alexandra stared at him, surprised. She had not expected this. "So," she began cautiously. "So, I'm offering you the job," he cut in. "A 3-month probationary period. You'll be part of the Gateway design team, reporting directly to Sophia, but you'll also provide regular updates to me. This project is too important for me to be completely hands-off." Alexandra felt a swirl of emotions. Joy, disbelief, but also wariness. Thomas Kowalski didn't seem like the type to forget an incident like theirs. "Thank you for the offer," she replied formally. "I'd like to accept, but I have one question." "Go on." "Is this offer based on my talent and qualifications, or is it a result of guilt over your behavior this morning?" For a split second, she thought she saw a flash of amusement in his eyes. "If I made decisions based on guilt, Miss Scott, I would have been out of business long ago. I'm hiring you because your vision for architecture is exactly what we need. And the fact that you had the courage to call me out when no one else would—" He hesitated. "Let's just say that's an added asset. This business needs people with a backbone." He extended his hand. "So, what's it going to be? Do you accept?" Alexandra hesitated for only a second before shaking his hand. It was warmer than she'd expected. "Yes, I accept." "Excellent," he said, releasing her hand and returning to his desk. "You start on Monday. Sophia will fill you in on the details. And Alexandra—" "Yes?" "Don't expect any special treatment. I'll judge your work just as harshly as I judge everyone else's." "I wouldn't expect anything less," she replied with a small smile. As she left his office, she could feel his intense gaze on her back. She had done it. She had landed a job at one of the top firms in the industry. But could she work under a man who had so easily gotten under her skin? And more importantly, how long could she keep her true identity a secret? Despite these questions, she couldn't suppress a smile. This was the first step toward proving to herself that she could make it on her own, even if it meant daily battles with the most infuriating man she had ever met. Sophia was waiting for her in the hall, her expression hopeful. "Well, I start on Monday," Alexandra said with a grin. Sophia looked genuinely pleased. "Wonderful! I knew he'd hire you." "Thomas has an eye for talent, even if he can be difficult at times." "Difficult is an understatement," Alexandra muttered, more to herself than to Sophia. Walking through the office toward the exit, Alexandra felt for the first time in a long while that her life was heading in the right direction. Hiding her name, working for an arrogant CEO, starting from the bottom, they were all challenges, but she was ready to face them. She stepped out of the high-rise into the sunny afternoon. The morning rain had given way to a bright sky and crisp air. Symbolic, she thought. The storm had passed, at least for now. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Alexandra's first day at KWA Architects began with chaos. Her alarm failed to go off, the L train was delayed, and by the time she finally reached the impressive high-rise, she was already 10 minutes late. "Great start," she muttered to herself, stepping breathlessly into the elevator. On the 20th floor, Sophia was waiting for her with a patient smile and a cup of coffee. "The first day is always stressful," she said, handing her the drink. "Come on, I'll show you to your desk and introduce you to the team." Alexandra let out a sigh of relief. At least she wasn't starting with a reprimand. The KWA office was buzzing with Monday morning energy. Architects hunched over screens, building models arranged on tables, lively discussions happening at whiteboards. It all created an atmosphere of creative ferment that Alexandra instantly loved. Her desk was in the area dedicated to the Lakeshore Gateway project, next to 3 other architects. Mark, a seasoned 40-something who specialized in structural engineering. Julia, an energetic 27-year-old in charge of sustainable solutions. And Peter, a quiet 30-year-old who handled the visualizations. "Welcome to the team," Mark greeted her with a warm smile. "Sophia said you have some great ideas for the courtyard." Alexandra felt a renewed sense of confidence. "Thanks. I hope I can bring something valuable to the project." "You will," Julia assured her, approaching her desk. "Every fresh mind is worth its weight in gold around here, especially since the deadlines are demanding." "Demanding is putting it mildly," Peter grumbled from behind his monitor. "The boss wants the first concepts in 2 weeks." "The boss?" Alexandra asked, though she already knew the answer. "Thomas Kowalski," Julia explained, lowering her voice. "Brilliant architect and businessman, but his expectations are from another planet. And his temperament, well, you'll see." "I already have," Alexandra replied, remembering their first encounter at the cafe. Before she could say more, a hush fell over the office. Thomas Kowalski had just entered the floor, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, speaking intently into his phone. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. People sat up straighter, lowered their voices, and stared more intensely at their screens. As he passed the Lakeshore Gateway section, Thomas noticed Alexandra. Their eyes met for a moment. He gave her a cool nod of acknowledgement and continued on his way without breaking his conversation. "Wow," Julia whispered, leaning toward Alexandra. You got a nod on your first day. Some people wait months for that. Alexandra scoffed. It's just a nod. In Kowalski's world, that's like a handshake from the king, Mark explained with amusement. Our boss isn't known for warm gestures. The rest of the day flew by as Alexandra dove into the project. The Lakeshore Gateway was set to be a flagship development, 5 buildings of varying heights, connected by a common public space, with an emphasis on green solutions and user comfort. An ambitious project, a prestigious client and tight deadlines, the perfect mix of stress and satisfaction. That evening, long after most employees had left, Alexandra was still studying the plans. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice Thomas standing by her desk. "First impressions?" he asked, startling her. She jumped slightly, then quickly composed herself. "It's an impressive project," she said professionally, "but I see a few areas that could be improved. For example, the flow of foot traffic between the buildings seems unnatural." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Unnatural? That's a precise term. People don't walk in straight lines," she explained, pointing to the plan. "They create organic pathways, following intuition and convenience. These geometric walkways look great on paper, but in practice, users will just cut across the lawns, creating their own trails." Thomas was silent for a moment, studying the plans, his face revealing nothing. "An interesting observation," he said finally. "Prepare an alternative proposal for the layout of the exterior spaces by Friday." "By Friday?" she repeated, trying to hide her surprise. That gave her just 4 days to completely redesign a key element of the project. "A problem?" he asked coolly, a challenging glint in his eyes. "Not at all," she replied, sitting up straighter. "It will be ready." He nodded and turned to leave, but stopped after a few steps. "Miss Scott," he said without turning back, "I'm curious why an architect of your talent applied specifically to us. Your projects, they seem far more ambitious than standard junior-level work." Alexandra felt her heart race. Did he suspect something? Could he sense she wasn't who she claimed to be? "I was looking for a place where I could grow," she answered carefully, "where my ideas would be heard, even as a junior architect." Thomas turned, studying her for a moment with that unreadable expression. "Interesting," he said finally. "Most young architects are looking for prestige, a high salary, high-profile projects, and you're looking for attention?" "Respect," she corrected him, "for my ideas, my work, my skills." For a split second she thought she saw the shadow of a smile on his face. "By Friday, Miss Scott," he repeated, then walked toward his office. The next few days were a blur of intense work. Alexandra stayed late, redesigning the exterior spaces of the Gateway complex, introducing organic shapes, utilizing natural pedestrian flow, and creating pockets for meeting and relaxation. She was in her element, finally doing what she loved, without the weight of the Warren name on her shoulders. On Thursday evening, as she was putting the final touches on her design, Julia came over to her desk. "Wow, this looks incredible," she said, looking at the renderings on Alexandra's screen. "I've never seen someone completely redesign something like this in 4 days. Kowalski is either going to kill you or give you a raise." Alexandra laughed nervously. "I'm hoping for the latter. Though honestly, I'd settle for him just accepting the design." "Kowalski rarely accepts anything on the first try," Peter warned, joining them. "It usually takes at least 3 revisions." "Well, we'll see," Alexandra said, saving her files. Just then, her phone buzzed. "Dad," flashed on the screen. Alexandra quickly silenced it. "Not going to get that?" Julia asked. "I'll call back later," she said evasively. "I need to finish these renderings." The truth was, she hadn't spoken to her father all week, deliberately avoiding his questions about her new job. John Warren, the real estate tycoon, would certainly be surprised to learn his daughter was working as a rank-and-file architect at a firm that was a rival to his own empire. Especially since KWA Architects was famous for having rejected a lucrative partnership with Warren Development a few years ago, a slight her father had never forgotten. It was one of the things she hadn't anticipated when she started this job, how hard it would be to keep it a secret from her family. Luckily, living alone in her Lincoln Park apartment, bought with her own earnings, though her father had offered her a luxury penthouse, she had at least some privacy. Friday morning. Alexandra arrived at the office earlier than usual, wanting to make some last-minute tweaks before her presentation. To her surprise, Thomas was already there, talking with Sophia by the project model. He saw her the moment she walked in and immediately ended his conversation. "Miss Scott, I hope you have good news for me," he said, approaching her desk. "The design is ready," she replied, turning on her computer. "I just wanted to make a few final adjustments." "Excellent. In that case, I'll expect a presentation in the conference room in half an hour." Alexandra froze. "A presentation? I thought you were just going to look over the files." "This is a key element of a multi-million-dollar project," he cut her off. "Of course I expect a formal presentation, with a justification for every decision." Before she could respond, he strode toward his office, leaving her in a state of mild panic. "Is he serious?" she asked Mark, who had just arrived. "Afraid so," he replied sympathetically. "Kowalski always demands a presentation. It's part of his philosophy. If you can't pitch your idea convincingly, then the idea isn't good enough." Alexandra took a deep breath. Presentations weren't a problem for her. As John Warren's daughter, she'd been attending business meetings and formal galas since she was a child. The problem was, she had only 30 minutes to prepare something that would normally take days. Her intense focus was broken by her phone, her father again. This time, he sent a text. "Alexandra, we need to talk about the proposal from the Qatar Investment Group. They're interested in partnering with us on a new project in Chicago. Call me ASAP. The Qatar Investment Group, one of the world's largest investors, specializing in luxury real estate. Alexandra knew her father had been courting them for months. This had to be a huge deal for him. But right now, she had no time for family business. She had to focus on her presentation. Exactly 30 minutes later, Alexandra stood in the conference room facing Thomas, Sophia, and 3 other directors. She had managed to pull together a professional presentation, display boards with renderings, flow diagrams, cost analyses. "As you can see," she said, gesturing to the screen, "traditional geometric layouts for outdoor spaces rarely correspond to natural human movement patterns. I'm proposing a more organic approach, pathways that follow intuitive routes, rest areas placed at strategic points, and greenery that integrates the buildings rather than separating them." Her voice was confident, her gestures professional. Despite the stress and the rush, the presentation was going perfectly until the conference room doors swung open. "Apologies for being late," a middle-aged man said, entering with an energetic stride. "Got stuck in traffic on the Kennedy." "Mr. Warren, welcome," Thomas said, rising to greet him. "You're just in time for the presentation of a new concept." John Warren, Alexandra's father, stopped in his tracks when he saw her standing by the screen. His face was a mask of utter astonishment. "Alexandra?" he asked in disbelief. Thomas looked between them, confused. "You two know each other?" Alexandra stood frozen, the presentation still displayed behind her, her father staring at her with a mixture of shock and bewilderment. "Yes," she said finally, feeling all her carefully constructed lies crumble like a house of cards. "He's my father." A stunned silence filled the room. Thomas's expression slowly shifted as he connected the dots. "Your father," he repeated slowly. "John Warren, which means you are—" "Alexandra Warren," she finished for him, drawing herself up to her full height. "Yes." Thomas stared at her, his blue eyes suddenly as cold as ice. "Why did you conceal your real identity during the hiring process?" Alexandra glanced at her father, who seemed as confused as Thomas, then turned back to her boss. "I wanted to be hired for my skills, not for my name." "I see," Thomas replied, his voice eerily calm. "So you felt the need to lie to all of us to prove your worth." It wasn't a lie, she protested. I simply used my mother's maiden name. Which you conveniently left off your resume, he interjected coolly. John Warren cleared his throat, clearly trying to manage the situation. Thomas, with all due respect, perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. My daughter obviously has her reasons. With all due respect, Mr. Warren, Thomas cut him off. I've just discovered I hired the daughter of my biggest competitor under a false name. You'll have to forgive me if I have some questions about her intentions. Alexandra felt anger mix with humiliation. My intentions were simple, she said sharply. I wanted to work as an architect, not as John Warren's daughter. I wanted my designs to be judged fairly without prejudice. And that's why you applied to the one firm that turned down a partnership with your father a few years ago? Thomas asked incredulously. That's quite a coincidence. John looked surprised. Alex, is that true? You knew about the history between my company and KWA? Alexandra could feel every eye in the room on her. Thomas's cool fury, her father's bewilderment, Sophia and the other directors' growing fascination. Yes, I knew, she finally admitted. And that's exactly why I applied here. KWA is the only major firm in Chicago that ever said no to my father. I figured if I had a chance of being judged fairly anywhere, it would be here. Her words hung in the air. Thomas stared at her, his expression unreadable. An interesting choice of words, he said at last. Fairly. Is hiding your identity your definition of fairness, Miss Warren? Before she could answer, John stepped toward her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Thomas, I understand your anger, but please, give my daughter a chance to explain. I'm as surprised as you are. I had no idea Alexandra was working at KWA. Thomas sized them both up for a long moment, then nodded. Fine. We'll finish this conversation in my office. Ladies and gentlemen, he said to the other attendees, we'll take a break. Sophia, please review Miss Warren's design and prepare your feedback. As they walked out of the conference room, Alexandra felt her carefully constructed world falling apart. Everything she had worked for, independence, recognition on her own terms, had just been called into question. And the worst part was, in Thomas's eyes, she saw not only anger, but something that looked disturbingly like betrayal. Why did his opinion matter so much to her? Why did she feel guilty for deceiving someone who was hardly a model of warmth or sincerity himself? It made no sense, but at that moment, walking down the hall between her father and her furious boss, Alexandra knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same, and the worst was yet to come. Thomas Kowalski's office radiated a chill, not just from the minimalist decor, but from the atmosphere that settled as soon as the door closed behind the three of them. Thomas sat behind his desk, gesturing for Alexandra and her father to take the chairs opposite him. Let's start with the basic question, he said, looking directly at Alexandra. Why would the daughter of John Warren, the heiress to a multi-billion-dollar empire, apply for a junior architect position at a rival firm under a false name? Alexandra took a deep breath. This was it. Because I wanted to prove I could succeed without my father's name, she answered, meeting his gaze head-on. In a world where everyone knows the Warrens, I can never be sure if I'm valued for my talent or for my connections. John shook his head in disbelief. Alexandra, I offered you a senior position at our company, the chance to design on a scale you can only dream of here. That's the whole point, Dad, she replied, turning to her father. I don't want anything handed to me. I want to earn it. Thomas scoffed. So, instead of rejecting your privilege, you decided to lie to a potential employer, an interesting way to prove your worth. I didn't plan for it to be a long-term strategy, Alexandra defended herself. I thought I'd work here for a few months, get some references, and then I could be myself. And what? Thomas leaned forward. You thought no one would connect the dots? Chicago isn't New York, Miss Warren. The real estate world is a small town. I was convinced you were working on a startup with your friends from school, John interjected. looking at his daughter with a mix of confusion and hurt. "That's why you were so evasive about work." An awkward silence fell. Alexandra felt her carefully laid plans disintegrating. The worst part was that deep down, she understood how this all looked, like deceit, manipulation, maybe even corporate espionage. "Mr. Warren," Thomas broke the silence, addressing John, "I assure you, I had no idea about your daughter's real identity. If I had known, you wouldn't have hired me," Alexandra finished. "That's exactly why I didn't tell you the truth. Because my name would have closed the door before I even had a chance to open it." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. "It's interesting that you assume I'm that prejudiced, given you barely know me." "You said it yourself, just now in the conference room," she countered. "I hired the daughter of my biggest competitor. Not a talented architect, but the daughter of my competitor." John cleared his throat, trying to diffuse the tension. "Thomas, I understand your outrage, but I assure you, I had no idea Alexandra was working for you. This was not some corporate conspiracy." "Really?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. Each eyes no. "So, it's just a coincidence that your daughter joined the team working on the Lakeshore Gateway project, the very project your firm was competing for, the very project that could save KWA from its financial troubles." Alexandra froze. "Financial troubles? What financial troubles?" Thomas clenched his jaw, clearly regretting that he'd let that slip. John sat up straighter, suddenly much more interested. "Is that true, Thomas? KWA is having liquidity problems?" "Our finances are not the subject of this conversation," Thomas cut him off sharply, then turned to Alexandra. "Though it's interesting you're so surprised, considering the rumors about our situation have been circulating in the industry for months." "I don't listen to rumors," she said honestly. "I applied to KWA because I admire your projects, your design philosophy, your approach to sustainability. If I wanted to spy on a competitor, I would have chosen a weaker firm than yours." For a moment, it seemed Thomas appreciated the compliment, but his face quickly became a mask again. "In any case, our professional relationship is over," he said coolly. "I understand your motivations, Miss Warren, but I cannot have someone who started with a lie working on my team, especially not on such a crucial project." Alexandra felt a pang in her chest, sharper than she'd expected. It wasn't just about losing the job, it was the way he was looking at her, with disappointment, as if he had truly believed she could be something special, and she had let him down. "I understand," she said quietly, standing up. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I'll go get my things." John stood up as well. "Thomas, could we speak in private? As businessmen?" Alexandra looked at her father, surprised. What was he planning? Thomas studied John for a moment, then nodded. "Alexandra, please wait outside." She walked out of the office on shaky legs. In the hallway, Sophia was waiting, a look of genuine sympathy on her face. "I'm sorry it turned out this way," she said softly. "Your design was truly brilliant." Alexandra tried to smile but couldn't. "Thank you. I'm just going to pack my things." At her desk, the whole team, Mark, Julia and Peter, was waiting, their faces a mix of consternation and curiosity. "So, you're the daughter of the John Warren?" Julia asked as Alexandra started putting her belongings in a box. "Yes," she answered curtly. "Why didn't you tell us?" Peter asked. "It's not like we would have judged you." Alexandra sighed. "Really? Look how everyone is looking at me now. I'm no longer Alexandra, the architect who redesigned the courtyard. I'm Alexandra Warren, the heiress who was playing at having a normal job." Mark shook his head. "To me, you're just a talented designer. It's a shame you're leaving. Your project really was great." His words brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you. That means a lot to me." Just as she finished packing, the door to Thomas's office opened. John and Thomas emerged, both with serious expressions. Her father, however, looked strangely satisfied. "Alexandra," John called out, "could you come back into the office? We have a proposal." She looked at them, confused, but obediently returned to Thomas's office. The men followed her in, closing the door. "I've just had a very interesting conversation with your father," Thomas began, sitting behind his desk, "regarding the future of the Lakeshore Gateway project." Alexandra looked questioningly at her father. "What did you propose?" John smiled faintly. "I propose something that might solve several problems at once. A partnership." "A partnership?" she repeated, stunned. "Warren Development and KWA Architects as partners on the Lakeshore Gateway project," John explained. "We bring the capital and the connections. They bring their creative vision and design expertise." Thomas folded his hands on the desk. "It's an unusual proposal given our history, but in KWA's current financial situation, it makes business sense." "And what about me?" Alexandra asked, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. On one hand, her father's proposal could save her job. On the other, she would once again owe everything to his name and money. "That's part of the deal," John replied. "You stay on the design team, as Alexandra Warren, not Scott." Thomas looked at her intently. "Your design for the courtyard was impressive. It would be a shame to waste it." "So what?" she asked in disbelief. "Suddenly my lie doesn't matter because my father offered you money?" "No," Thomas said sharply. "Your lie is still a problem, but your talent is real, and your motives, I can understand them, even if I don't condone your methods." A moment of silence passed as Alexandra tried to process everything. "If I stay," she said finally. "On what terms?" "As a full member of the team," Thomas answered. "No special treatment, no kid gloves, but also no more pretending you're someone you're not." John smiled with satisfaction. "It's a fair offer, Alexandra. You can develop your skills in a professional environment without having to hide your identity." Alexandra looked at the two men, sensing how many unsaid emotions and calculations were behind this proposal. Her father finally had his chance to work with KWA, and Thomas was getting the financial backing he clearly needed. Everyone won, but she felt like a pawn in their game. "I need to think about it," she said at last. Thomas raised his eyebrows. "I thought you cared about this job." "I did. I do," she corrected herself. "But I don't want to be part of a business deal. I want to be valued for my skills, not my name." "And you will be," Thomas assured her, and for the first time she heard a new note in his voice. Something like respect. "If your next designs are as good as the courtyard, no one will be asking about your last name." She looked him straight in the eye, searching for any sign of manipulation, but all she saw was the intensity that had always intrigued her. "Fine," she decided. "I'll stay, but on my own terms." "Which are?" Thomas asked. "I want to be judged just as harshly as any other employee. No privileges, no special considerations, and I want my project to be realized exactly as I designed it." Thomas looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Agreed, but I have one condition of my own." "Which is?" "Complete honesty from now on. No more secrets, Miss Warren." "Alexandra," she corrected him. "If we're going to be working together, you can call me by my first name." For a split second, she thought she saw the shadow of a smile on his face. "As you wish, Alexandra." John clapped his hands, clearly pleased with how things had turned out. "Excellent. I propose we celebrate with dinner. What do you say to tonight? I have a reservation at Alinea." Alexandra and Thomas glanced at each other, both clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "I'm afraid I already have plans for this evening," Thomas replied diplomatically. "Me too," Alexandra added quickly. John looked at them with amusement. "I understand. Well, another time, perhaps. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get back to my office. We have many details of this partnership to discuss, Thomas, but that can wait until Monday." After John left, a silence settled in the office. Alexandra and Thomas looked at each other, both unsure of what to say. "I didn't ask him to do that," she said finally. "That investment, I don't want you to think this was all planned." "I know," he replied after a moment. "Your surprise was too genuine. But it doesn't change the fact that you started this job with a lie." "I didn't lie about my skills," she reminded him, "only about my name. Names matter in our world, Alexandra, he said quietly. Whether we like it or not. She heard a note of bitterness in his words that made her wonder about his own story. What had made Thomas Kowalski the man he was today? The cold, demanding perfectionist? Despite all that, he continued, your design really is good, and I want to see what else you can do. It was probably the closest thing to a compliment she would ever get from him. Alexandra felt a warmth spread through her chest. Thank you. I promise I won't let you down. We'll see, he replied, but his voice was softer than usual. Now, get back to work. We have a project to finish. As she left his office, she could feel his intense gaze on her. Something had shifted between them. The secret was out. The cards were on the table. And though it seemed that everything had worked out, Alexandra couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much more complicated story. In the main office, she was met with questions, curious glances, and whispered comments. But she was also met with acceptance and respect for a design that was truly good. Maybe, Alexandra thought, maybe it was possible to be a Warren and a valued member of a team at the same time. And maybe, a quiet voice in her head whispered, there was something more hiding behind this professional facade, something that neither she nor Thomas was ready to admit yet. Monday morning brought a mix of feelings for Alexandra. On one hand, she was relieved to have kept her job. On the other, she knew nothing would ever be the same. Walking into the KWA office, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. News of her true identity had spread like wildfire. Well, if it isn't the heiress herself, gracing us with her presence, Peter muttered as she sat down at her desk, though there was more amusement than malice in his voice. Give it a rest, Julia scolded him, bringing Alexandra a cup of coffee. Imagine what it would be like if everyone judged you by your family. Thanks, Alexandra accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. And I'm sorry for hiding the truth. Hey, we get it, Mark assured her. Besides, Kowalski agreed to let you stay. That's saying something. Exactly, Julia leaned in conspiratorially. What did you say to him? Or rather, what did your father say? Because Kowalski never changes his mind. Alexandra hesitated. She didn't want to disclose the details of the financial deal between KWA and Warren Development. Let's just say we found some common ground, she replied evasively. Before they could press her further, the familiar, decisive footsteps echoed through the office. Thomas Kowalski was striding through the space, impeccably dressed as always, his face set in concentration. Meeting in 10 minutes, he announced, stopping by their section. Alexandra, bring the renderings of the courtyard. Your father is already waiting in the conference room. His tone was professional, with no trace of personal resentment, but also no warmth. She nodded, trying to hide her nerves. 10 minutes later, the entire Lakeshore Gateway team, along with the KWA board and representatives from Warren Development, were gathered in the spacious conference room. John Warren, elegant and confident as ever, sat beside Thomas as an equal partner. Alexandra took a seat between Julia and Mark, trying to ignore the curious glances directed her way. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas began, standing up, I'm pleased to officially announce that the Lakeshore Gateway project has gained a powerful new partner. Warren Development is joining us as a strategic investor, bringing not only capital, but also extensive business connections. John smiled with satisfaction. KWA Architects has always been distinguished by their innovative approach to design. I'm delighted that our firms can join forces to create something truly exceptional. Alexandra watched this exchange of pleasantries with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Just a week ago, her father had considered KWA to be arrogant competitors who overestimated their abilities. Now suddenly they were innovative. As part of this partnership, Thomas continued, we have decided to expand the original concept. In addition to office and retail space, the Lakeshore Gateway will now include a residential component, premium apartments to be designed by an expanded team. He glanced in Alexandra's direction. "Miss Warren, I'd like you to present your concept for the courtyard, which became the starting point for our partnership." Alexandra felt every eye in the room turn to her. This was a test of her professionalism, her talent, and her ability to handle pressure. She stood, took a deep breath, and began her presentation. For the next 15 minutes, she spoke about her vision, displaying renderings, explaining the concept of organic pathways, natural rest zones, and the integration of greenery with architecture. She spoke confidently, professionally, as if the past few days hadn't been an emotional roller coaster. When she finished, a silence fell. John looked at her with unconcealed pride, and Thomas, it was hard to read his expression, but was that a glimmer of approval in his eyes? "Thank you, Alexandra," he said finally. "It's a bold vision that fits perfectly with the new, expanded project. From today, you will be responsible for coordinating all exterior spaces in the complex." Alexandra blinked in surprise. She had expected to keep her position, but a promotion? Now. "Thank you for your trust," she replied professionally, though her heart was pounding. "I won't let you down." "I'm sure you won't," Thomas replied, his gaze lingering on her for a fraction of a second too long. The following days passed in a whirlwind. The expanded project demanded intense work, long hours, and constant coordination between teams. Alexandra, now responsible for a small sub-team, discovered that managing people wasn't easy, especially when some still saw her primarily as Warren's daughter. Gradually, however, she began to earn their respect with her knowledge, hard work, and fair approach. She didn't leverage her position or try to impress with her name. She just did what she loved, designing beautiful, functional spaces. Thomas remained an enigma. Professional, demanding, sometimes sharp in his feedback, but also increasingly appreciative of her work. Their weekly meetings about the project's progress began to stretch longer, filled with discussions about architecture, sustainable development, and urban trends. She discovered a passion and knowledge in him that fascinated her more than she was willing to admit. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, Thomas stopped by her desk. She was working on a tricky element of the project, the connection between the office and the newly added residential section. "Why architecture?" he asked suddenly, leaning against the wall of her cubicle. She looked up at him, surprised. "Excuse me? You could have chosen anything," he explained. "With your name, your money, your connections, you could have been anything you wanted." "Why architecture?" Alexandra thought for a moment. "Because buildings remain," she said finally. "Long after we're gone, long after our names and our egos. What we created is what's left, and it's either something of value or it isn't." Thomas looked at her intently, as if seeing her for the first time. "An interesting answer," he said quietly. "And you?" she asked boldly. "Why architecture?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Thomas Kowalski rarely spoke about himself. "Because it was the one thing no one could take from me," he said at last, and a new note entered his voice. The talent, the vision, the skill. Before she could ask what he meant, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression immediately hardened. "I have to take this," he said, reverting to his professional tone. "Good night, Alexandra." "Good night, Thomas," she replied, testing his first name for the first time. He paused for a moment, glanced back at her over his shoulder, then nodded and walked away, answering the call. Alexandra returned to her work, but her thoughts kept circling back to their brief conversation. Who was Thomas Kowalski really? What was he hiding behind that professional facade, and why did she so desperately want to find out? 3 weeks later, during a presentation of the advanced project version to investors, the unexpected happened. As Thomas was discussing the financial aspects of the investment, he suddenly went pale, stopped mid-sentence and swayed slightly. "Excuse me," he said, leaning on the table. "I need a moment." Before anyone could react, he left the conference room. Alexandra, sitting closest to the door, instinctively stood up. "Excuse me for a moment," she said to the bewildered investors and hurried out after him. She found him in an empty hallway, leaning against the wall, his eyes closed, his face ashen. "Thomas? What's wrong?" she asked with concern. He opened his eyes, clearly unhappy to see her. "Nothing! Get back to the meeting," he said sharply, but his voice was weaker than usual. "You look like you're about to faint," she insisted, moving closer. "When was the last time you ate something?" He hesitated. "Yesterday, I think." "You think?" she repeated in disbelief. "You're working so hard on this project that you forget to eat." "I don't need a babysitter, Alexandra," he replied, but without his usual coldness. "No, you need someone to remind you that you're a human being, not a machine," she retorted. "Wait here." She ran to the office kitchen and returned with an orange juice and a protein bar. "This isn't a request," she said, handing them to him. "It's the condition for me going back into that meeting and salvaging the presentation you just walked out on." He looked at her with a mixture of irritation and, was that amusement? "Are you always this bossy?" he asked, though he opened the juice. "Only when my boss tries to pass out during a key presentation," she replied with a small smile. He drank the juice and ate the bar, and the color slowly returned to his face. "Better?" she asked. "Yes," he admitted reluctantly. "Thank you." "You're welcome. Now let's get back in there before the investors start to wonder what's going on." As she turned to leave, he gently caught her wrist. It was the first time he had voluntarily touched her. "Alexandra," he said quietly, I don't want anyone to know about what happened." She understood. Thomas Kowalski, the perfect, infallible leader, couldn't show weakness. "Of course," she replied. "It stays between us." He released her hand, but for a moment their eyes met, and Alexandra felt something, a spark, a connection, a shared understanding she couldn't name. They returned to the meeting together. Thomas finished his presentation with renewed energy, and when Alexandra took over to discuss the design aspects, she could feel his eyes on her, intense but no longer cold, more interested. After the meeting, once the satisfied investors had left and the team was gathering their materials, Thomas approached her. "Thank you," he said softly, so only she could hear, "for the discretion." "You're welcome," she replied just as quietly, "but maybe you should slow down sometimes. This project isn't worth your health." She expected a dismissal, a reminder of the hierarchy, perhaps even a sarcastic comment. Instead, Thomas looked at her with a strange expression, a mix of surprise and something softer. "This project is all I have," he said, so quietly she barely heard him. "If it doesn't succeed—" He didn't finish, but he didn't have to. Alexandra understood. KWA was in real financial trouble, and the Lakeshore Gateway was their last chance. A wave of empathy washed over her. "It will succeed," she assured him with conviction. "We're all working too hard for it not to." Their eyes met, and for a moment it seemed he wanted to say more. Instead, he just nodded. "Good night, Alexandra." "Good night, Thomas." As she left the office that night, she knew something had changed. The barrier between them, built of mistrust, lies, and professional distance, was starting to crack. And though she tried to convince herself it was just a professional relationship, something in Thomas's gaze, in his voice, in that brief moment of weakness he had shown her, made her heart beat a little faster. The Lakeshore Gateway was taking shape, but between them something else was forming, something unplanned, unforeseen, and potentially far more complicated than any architectural problem. A month after the incident during the presentation, the Lakeshore Gateway project reached a critical stage. Construction on the first building had begun, and the team was working on the final details for the rest of the complex. The tension in the office was palpable. Deadlines were looming, investors were demanding, and Thomas was more demanding than ever. Alexandra, however, noticed a subtle shift in his behavior toward her. His criticism became more constructive, less cutting. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. and their late-night discussions about the project often drifted to more personal topics: favorite buildings, inspiring architects, design philosophies. "I don't understand why you're so insistent on these curved lines in the entrance plaza," he said one evening, looking over her latest sketches. They were alone in the conference room, surrounded by blueprints and renderings, with takeout containers between them. "Because people don't move in straight lines," she replied, reaching for a pencil. "I've watched it for years. Even when a sidewalk is straight, people create paths on a diagonal, in an arc. They follow instinct, not geometry." Thomas studied her with fascination. How does a designer with that philosophy end up in a development family known for maximizing profit per square foot? Alexandra smiled faintly. "Maybe because I've always liked defying expectations." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "Or maybe because I wanted to change the way my family sees architecture, to prove that buildings aren't just investments, but places that shape people's lives." Thomas looked at her intently. "And that's why you hid your name, because you wanted to prove you were more than just an heiress?" "Yes," she admitted honestly. "Is that so hard to understand?" He was silent for a long moment, fiddling with his chopsticks. "No," he said finally, "I understand it better than you think." Something in his tone made her look at him with new curiosity. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell her. "Do you know why KWA is in financial trouble?" he asked instead of answering. "I've heard rumors," she said cautiously. "Failed investments, losing key clients." "Partly true," he nodded, "but the real trouble started 3 years ago when I rejected a merger offer from Global Design Group." "The American giant?" she asked, surprised. "They wanted to buy you?" "Yes. They offered a fortune." His face hardened at the memory. "But the price was our independence, our values. We would have become a factory for generic corporate designs. So you refused." "Exactly. And ever since, GDG has been doing everything it can to make our lives difficult. They poach our clients, buy out our talent, spread rumors about our supposed insolvency." He sighed heavily. "That's why the Lakeshore Gateway is so important. It's our chance to prove we're still in the game, that we can create architecture that matters." Alexandra looked at him with a new understanding. So that was why he was so desperate for this project to succeed. That was why he worked himself to the point of collapse, forgetting even to eat. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. Their eyes met across the table. "Because I think you also know what it's like to fight for something more than just money," he replied, just as softly. "For the right to be judged for who you really are, not for the label others have attached to you." In that moment, something between them shifted. It was as if a wall they had both built had crumbled, leaving them suddenly exposed, vulnerable, real. Alexandra didn't know what to say. Instead, she impulsively reached across the table and placed her hand on his. It was a simple gesture of support, but as their skin touched, she felt a jolt she hadn't expected. Thomas looked down at their joined hands, then up at her, his eyes full of an emotion she had never seen in him before. The moment was broken by the ring of his phone. Alexandra pulled her hand back as if burned, and Thomas reached for the device. "I have to take this," he said, standing up. "It's the investors from Qatar." "Of course," she replied, trying to hide her disappointment. As he left the room, Alexandra was left alone, trying to calm her racing heart. What had just happened? Had she really felt what she thought she had? And had he felt it too? The next day, the atmosphere was tense. Thomas avoided her gaze during the morning meeting, and she wasn't sure how to act. She threw herself into her work, trying to focus on tasks, not on the memory of their joined hands and the intensity of his eyes. In the afternoon, Mark approached her desk. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. "You seem a million miles away." "Yeah, just tired," she lied with a weak smile. Mark studied her. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." His tone suggested he guessed more than she was saying. But before she could respond, a murmur went through the office. They both turned to see a smartly dressed, middle-aged man striding purposefully toward Thomas's office. "Who's that?" Alexandra asked. "Richard Miller," Mark answered, lowering his voice. "The European Director for Global Design Group. I wonder what he wants." Alexandra felt a prickle of unease. After what Thomas had told her last night about GDG, a visit from their director could not be good news. For the next hour, a nervous energy filled the office. Everyone kept glancing toward Thomas's office, where an animated discussion between him and Miller was visible through the glass walls. Finally, the door opened and the men emerged, both with stone-faced expressions. Miller gave a curt nod to the staff and left the office, while Thomas stopped at Alexandra's desk. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice tight with tension. "In private." She followed him into an empty conference room, feeling the curious eyes of the team on her back. "What's going on?" she asked as he closed the door behind them. "Who was that man?" "Richard Miller, from GDG, Thomas replied, his face pale with anger. "He came with an offer we can't refuse. Either we sell KWA, or they'll release information that will destroy our reputation." "What information?" Alexandra asked, a growing sense of dread creeping over her. Thomas looked her straight in the eye. "That we're only partnering with Warren Development because we hired the owner's daughter, that it's nepotism and a conflict of interest, that the Lakeshore Gateway project is a sham, and that we're on the verge of bankruptcy." Alexandra felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not true. I was hired for my skills, and the partnership with my father came later." "You and I know that," Thomas replied, "but it won't look that way in the industry press, especially when they add the fact that you initially hid your real name." A wave of anger rose in her. "So what now? You're going to give up? Sell the company?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment, a battle of emotions raging in his eyes. "No," he said finally, "I won't give in to blackmail. But we have to be prepared for the worst. If GDG releases these accusations, the project could be in jeopardy. The investors might pull out." "What can I do?" she asked without hesitation. Thomas looked surprised by her determination. "You're not afraid? This could damage your reputation too." "I care about this project," she answered honestly, "and I care about KWA." Their eyes met, and for a moment it seemed he wanted to say something personal. Instead, he straightened up, reverting to his professional tone. "We need to accelerate our work. The more we can get done, the harder it will be to stop the project. And we need to prepare a communications strategy for if and when the accusations surface." Alexandra nodded. "I'll talk to my father. Maybe his lawyers can help." "Thank you," he said, and she heard genuine gratitude in his voice. As she was leaving the conference room, he called after her. "Alexandra." She turned. "Yes?" "I'm sorry I dragged you into this," he said quietly. "If I had known it would lead to this—" "I don't regret it," she interrupted him. "Not for a second." Their eyes met again, full of unspoken words and emotions. For the next few days, they worked like mad, fast-tracking the project, perfecting every detail, preparing for the worst. Alexandra barely left the office, and neither did Thomas. They were often the last two there, working side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes in fierce debate. One evening, as rain drummed against the office windows and they hunched over the complex's model, Thomas suddenly straightened up and looked at her. "Why are you here, Alexandra?" he asked quietly. "You could be anywhere else, doing anything. You don't have to put up with all this stress, this fight." She looked up at him. "I'm here because I believe in this project," she said. "I believe in what we're doing." "Is that the only reason?" he pressed, and she heard something in his voice she couldn't quite name. Hope, fear. Her heart beat faster as she gathered the courage to answer truthfully. "No," she said softly. "It's not the only reason." They stood facing each other, separated only by the table with the model, but the distance between them felt both vast and non-existent. Alexandra could see Thomas wrestling with himself, with the desire to move closer and the fear of what it would mean. Just then, the elevator chimed. Someone was coming back to the office. They quickly stepped apart, resuming professional postures, but something had changed. A line had been crossed, words had been spoken, not directly, but clearly enough. John Warren entered the room, a grim expression on his face. "Thomas, Alexandra," he said, approaching them. "I just got a call from my contacts in the industry press. GDG has started spreading rumors. There might be an article tomorrow accusing us of a conflict of interest." Thomas paled, but his voice remained steady. "What rumors, exactly?" "That you hired my daughter to save your firm from bankruptcy. That the whole project is a massive sham. And worse," John hesitated, glancing at Alexandra, "that there's something more than a professional relationship between you two, which complicates things even further." Alexandra felt a flush creep up her cheeks. Was it that obvious? Had others noticed the tension between them too? Thomas looked equally taken aback. "That's absurd," he said firmly. "Our relationship is completely professional." But as he said it, his eyes met hers for a fleeting second, and they both knew that wasn't the whole truth. John looked between them, clearly seeing the unspoken tension. "Whatever is between you," he said finally, "you need to put it aside. Right now, what matters is the project and the reputations of both our companies." "What do you propose?" Thomas asked, crossing his arms. "We get ahead of them," John replied. "We'll hold a press conference tomorrow morning. We'll present the partnership between KWA and Warren Development with full transparency. We'll highlight your talent, Alexandra, and the fact that you were hired before the partnership was formed." Alexandra nodded, though she felt a pang of disappointment. Once again, her career would be defined by her name, not her talent. "And what about the other part of the rumors?" she asked quietly. John and Thomas exchanged a look. "It would be best if you limit your contact to a minimum for a while," John said. "At least until the project is well into the construction phase." "That's impossible," Thomas protested. "Alexandra is a key member of the team. She's coordinating the entire exterior space." "Then you have to be very careful," John warned. "No one-on-one meetings, no late nights at the office. Everything has to be transparent and professional." Thomas and Alexandra looked at each other, both aware that this meant the end of their late-night discussions, of those moments of closeness that had become so important to them. "Understood," Thomas said finally, though his voice sounded hollow. "Right," Alexandra agreed, trying to hide the ache she felt. John seemed relieved. "Good. Then I'll see you at the press conference tomorrow." 8 in the morning, ground floor conference room. When he left them alone, they stood for a moment in awkward silence. There was so much to say, yet nothing could be said, not now when everything was on the line. "I guess we should call it a night," Thomas said at last, not meeting her eyes. "Yeah," she agreed quietly. "See you tomorrow." But as she gathered her things, she felt his hand on her arm, light, cautious, as if he were afraid of scaring her off. "Alexandra," he said softly, "whatever happens, thank you. For everything." She looked up at him, seeing so much unsaid emotion in his eyes, it almost took her breath away. "We're not done yet," she replied with determination. "We're not going to let GDG destroy this project, or KWA. For a split second, she thought he wanted to say more, something personal. Instead, he just nodded. "I'll see you at the press conference." As she walked out of the office into the rainy night, Alexandra knew the coming days would be the hardest test yet, not just for the Lakeshore Gateway project, not just for her career, but for the elusive, unexpected feeling that was growing between her and Thomas, a feeling that had to remain hidden, at least for now. The press conference began promptly at 8 in the morning. The ground floor conference room of the KWA Tower was filled with journalists, industry representatives, and investors. On the dais sat John Warren, Thomas Kowalski, and Alexandra, professional, composed, though the tension between them was palpable to anyone who knew what to look for. "Thank you for coming," Thomas began in a calm, confident voice. "We've called this conference to offer full transparency on the partnership between KWA Architects and Warren Development for the Lakeshore Gateway project." Recently, there has been some speculation that we would like to address. For the next 30 minutes, they presented the project's timeline, explained how Alexandra had been hired, emphasizing that it happened before the partnership between the firms was established, and showcased renderings of the complex in its current form. "Now, I'd like to turn it over to Alexandra Warren," John said, gesturing for his daughter to take the microphone. "The lead designer for the exterior spaces of the Lakeshore Gateway complex." Alexandra stood, feeling dozens of pairs of eyes on her. She knew this was the moment of truth, her chance to prove her worth as an architect, not as John Warren's daughter. "The Lakeshore Gateway is more than just buildings," she began, displaying her renderings on the screen behind her. "It's a space that will shape the daily experiences of thousands of people. My vision is based on several key principles." She spoke with passion, professionalism, and expertise, presenting her innovative solutions, explaining every design decision, and answering journalists' questions with a confidence and eloquence that impressed even the biggest skeptics. When she finished, she caught a look in Thomas's eyes that made her heart race. Pride, admiration, and something more, something deeper, that had to remain unspoken. The conference seemed to be a success. The media focused on the project, the innovative designs, and the economic potential for the city, not on the alleged conflict of interest. They had gotten ahead of GDG. But the peace didn't last long. A week later, as the project entered a crucial construction phase, Julia rushed into the KWA office, holding a tablet. "You have to see this," she said, placing the device on the conference table where the Lakeshore Gateway team was having their morning meeting. On the screen was the headline of an article, "Romance on the Construction Site? Secret Relationship Between Lakeshore Gateway Leaders." Below it was a grainy photo of Thomas and Alexandra talking intently in the conference room, their faces close together, their hands almost touching over a set of blueprints. Alexandra felt the blood drain from her face. The photo was innocent, just two professionals discussing the project, but the headline gave it an entirely different context. "Where did this come from?" Thomas asked, his voice icy with anger. "An industry blog, Arch News, funded by, guess who? GDG, Julia replied, scrolling through the article. "They're saying the Lakeshore Gateway project is a cover for personal arrangements, that business decisions are being made based on personal affections." Alexandra closed her eyes, feeling a wave of humiliation. Everything she had worked for, her professionalism, her talent, her independence, had been undermined by one sensationalist article. "That's ridiculous," Mark said firmly. "Anyone who's seen Alexandra's work knows she was hired for her skills. And anyone who knows Kowalski knows he doesn't make business decisions with his heart," Peter added, trying to lighten the mood. Alexandra appreciated their support, but she knew the damage was done. The real estate industry loved gossip, and this story had everything: an heiress, a stern CEO, a business rivalry, a supposed affair. "We have to deal with this," Thomas said finally, regaining his composure. "But not now. Right now we have a project to finish." He looked at Alexandra, and in his eyes she saw determination and something that gave her strength. Faith. Faith in her skills, in the belief that together they could overcome this. "Exactly," she agreed, straightening her back. "The best response is to finish the Lakeshore Gateway on schedule and make it a success." The team returned to work with renewed determination, but Alexandra knew the rumors would only grow, and she was right. For the next month, the industry media buzzed with speculation. Every business meeting, every joint presentation, every glance between her and Thomas was analyzed, interpreted, and twisted. Investors began to express concern, and some even threatened to pull out. Alexandra and Thomas, following John's advice, limited their interactions to an absolute minimum, always in the presence of others, always strictly professional. But the emotional toll was immense. She missed their late-night discussions, those rare moments when she saw him smile, the intensity in his eyes when he appreciated her ideas. On a Friday afternoon, after most of the team had left, Alexandra sat alone in the office working on the final revisions for the courtyard design. Construction on the first building was well underway, but the pressure wasn't letting up. Quite the opposite. "I thought you would have gone home by now," she heard a familiar voice say. Thomas stood in the doorway, his coat slung over his arm, looking as tired as she felt. "I wanted to finish these revisions," she replied, trying to sound professional, though her heart beat faster at the sight of him. He looked at her for a moment, as if fighting an internal battle. Finally, he entered the room and closed the door. "Alexandra, we need to talk," he said quietly. "Not about the project, about us." She froze, not expecting such directness. "I don't think that's a good idea," she replied cautiously. "Not now, when the media's just waiting for more sensational material." "I know," he agreed, moving closer. "But we can't keep going on like this situation, these rumors. They're affecting the project, the team." "And what do you propose?" she asked, standing to level the distance between them. Thomas hesitated, as if unsure what to say next. Finally, he sighed heavily. "Maybe I should step back from direct oversight of the project, hand it over to Sophia. That might quiet the rumors." Alexandra felt a pang of pain at the thought of him leaving. "It's your project," she protested. "It's your company. If anyone should step back, it's—" "No," he cut her off firmly. "Don't even think about it. You're too valuable to this project." "And you're not?" she asked, taking a step closer. They stood facing each other, closer than they had been in a month, the tension between them almost palpable. "Thomas," she said softly, "what's happening to us?" He looked at her intently, and in his eyes she saw all the emotions he so carefully hid from others: uncertainty, fear, desire. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice softer than ever. "All I know is that I can't focus when you're around, that I think about you when I shouldn't, that this whole situation is driving me crazy." Her heart raced at his words, confirmation that what she felt wasn't one-sided. "Me too," she admitted quietly, "but what can we do? If the media finds out there really is something between us, it will be the end of KWA," he finished for her. "I know. That's why we have to find another solution." Just then the office door swung open, and John Warren stood there, his face contorted with anger. "What do you two think you're doing?" he asked sharply. "I just got a call from a reporter at Arch News who claims to have new photos of you two in a compromising situation. And I find you here, alone, after hours?" Alexandra and Thomas instinctively moved apart. "Dad, it's not—" Alexandra began, but John held up a hand, silencing her. "I don't care what it is. I care what it looks like. And it looks terrible. Investors are pulling out, GDG is spreading more rumors, and you two can't maintain a professional distance." Thomas stood up straight, his face becoming an impenetrable mask. "Mr. Warren, I assure you, our relationship is completely professional. We were discussing the project." John snorted in disbelief. "Really?" "Because I read something completely different on your faces. Now listen to me, both of you." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's too much at stake. A multi-million-dollar project, the reputations of both our companies, the future of KWA. Do you really want to risk all that for— what exactly?" Alexandra felt anger mix with shame. Her father was talking to her as if she were a teenager incapable of making rational decisions. "Dad, I appreciate your concern, but I'm an adult and apparently an irresponsible one," he interrupted. "I thought you cared more about your career, your independence, proving your worth, and now you're risking it all for an office romance." He had hit a nerve. Alexandra fell silent, realizing how this must look from the outside. An heiress who first hides her identity and then gets involved with her boss. "It's not a romance," Thomas said suddenly, his voice firm. "It's something more." John and Alexandra both looked at him, surprised. "Excuse me." John raised his eyebrows. Thomas looked at Alexandra, and she saw determination in his eyes. "You were right, John," he said, not taking his eyes off her. "There's too much at stake. The project, the companies, the future. But there's something else at stake too. Happiness. Mine. And I hope Alexandra's. Alexandra's heart stopped for a moment. Was he really? What exactly are you trying to say? John asked, crossing his arms. That yes, I have feelings for your daughter, Thomas replied, finally turning to John. Feelings I didn't plan on, didn't expect, but that I'm not going to hide anymore. And if the media wants to turn that into a sensation, then so be it. Alexandra stared at him in disbelief, feeling tears well up in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief and something she could only call joy. John looked as if he didn't know whether to laugh or explode in fury. Do you realize what this means for the project? He asked finally. Yes, Thomas answered, and I'm prepared to face the consequences, but I'm not prepared to pretend I don't feel what I feel. A silence fell as John measured them both with his gaze. Finally, he sighed heavily. Well, at least you're honest, he said, turning to Thomas. That's more than I can say for most men your age and in your position. He looked at Alexandra, and his expression softened slightly. Is it true? You feel the same? Alexandra looked at Thomas, then at her father. Yes, she said quietly but firmly, and I'm not going to apologize for what I feel, or pretend it doesn't exist. John looked at them for a long moment, then unexpectedly smiled. You know what? Maybe this isn't such a bad outcome after all. Alexandra and Thomas exchanged confused glances. What do you mean? She asked. John relaxed, leaning against the doorframe. Since the media is already writing about your romance, maybe instead of denying it, we should use it, he proposed. Turn these rumors into something positive, a love story on the site of a prestigious project. The media will eat it up. But how will that affect our professionalism? Alexandra asked, unsure if she understood her father's intentions. If the project is completed on schedule and becomes a success, no one will question your professionalism, John replied. And that kind of media attention might even attract new investors. People love a good story. Thomas looked at John with a mixture of disbelief and growing respect. Are you seriously suggesting we use our feelings as a marketing strategy? No, John corrected him. I'm suggesting you stop hiding and be yourselves. And if it happens to help the project, all the better. Alexandra couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her father, the ever-pragmatic businessman, was giving them his blessing. But there's one condition, John added, his face becoming serious again. If this is going to work, it has to be real. No games, no faking feelings for the good of the project, because if you hurt my daughter... He gave Thomas a warning look. I would never do that, Thomas replied with a conviction that made Alexandra's heart beat faster. What I feel is real. John nodded, apparently satisfied. In that case, I'll leave you two alone. You have a lot to discuss, he said, turning to leave. And Thomas, he paused in the doorway. Welcome to the family. I hope you like complicated holidays. When the door closed behind John, Alexandra and Thomas stood for a moment in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. Did your father just give us his blessing? Thomas asked finally, the first real smile in weeks appearing on his face. I think so, Alexandra replied, smiling back. And I think he just turned our love life into a marketing campaign. They both laughed, and the tension of the past few weeks began to dissipate like air from a punctured balloon. Alexandra, Thomas said, suddenly serious. What I told your father, it's true. My feelings are real, but I don't expect you to return them just because I said so. She walked over to him, stopping just in front of him. And what if I say I already do? She asked softly. That I've been fighting what I feel for weeks? That I've missed our late-night talks more than I can say? His eyes widened slightly, and an expression she had never seen on him before appeared on his face, pure, unadulterated joy. Without a word, he moved closer, his hand gently touching her cheek. This time, there was no desk between them, no project, no professional barriers. It was just them, a man and a woman who had found each other in the most unexpected of places. When their lips finally met, Alexandra felt as if all the pieces of her life had suddenly clicked into place. This wasn't the end of their problems. The media would still write, rumors would still circulate, and the Lakeshore Gateway project still needed to be completed. But now they had something that gave them the strength to face it all. They had each other. 3 months later, the Lakeshore Gateway Business Center gleamed in the autumn sun, officially open to its first tenants. In front of the main entrance, a crowd of journalists, investors and guests watched as John Warren, Thomas Kowalski and Alexandra cut the ribbon, standing side by side with smiles on their faces. "I am proud to declare the Lakeshore Gateway Complex open," John said into the microphone. "A project that not only changes the face of this part of the city, but also proves that collaboration between our companies can yield exceptional results." Applause erupted from the crowd, and cameras flashed, capturing the moment of triumph. "I would like to especially thank 2 people without whom this project would not have been possible," John continued. "My daughter, Alexandra Warren, whose vision for the exterior spaces gave this place its unique character, and Thomas Kowalski, whose determination and uncompromising pursuit of excellence allowed us to overcome all obstacles." Alexandra and Thomas exchanged a look, their hands discreetly intertwining out of the camera's view. The media had indeed fallen in love with their story. A talented architect falling for her demanding boss while working on a prestigious project. The initial sensational headlines gradually gave way to articles about their professionalism, the innovative solutions used in the project, and even how their relationship showcased a new model of collaboration in the industry. GDG had tried a few more times to harm the project, but as the first buildings rose and investor interest remained high, even they had to back down. After the official ceremony, as guests dispersed to tour the complex, Alexandra and Thomas found a moment for themselves in the courtyard, the very one she had designed, which had become a symbol of her talent and the beginning of their shared story. "You look like a true empire heiress today," Thomas teased, wrapping an arm around her waist. "And you look like the perfect CEO, as always," she retorted, adjusting his tie. "But you know what? I prefer you as Thomas, the one who forgets to eat when he's absorbed in a project, and who has the most beautiful smile when no one is looking." He smiled that very smile, warm, genuine, reserved only for her. "And I prefer you as Alexandra," he replied, "the one who speaks up when everyone else is silent and who sees beauty where others see only functionality." They looked at the complex surrounding them, at the organic pathways winding between buildings, at the rest areas filled with greenery, at the harmony of modern architecture and nature. "We did it," Alexandra said quietly, "against all odds." "Thanks to you," Thomas replied, pulling her closer. "You changed not only this project, but me as well." "And myself," she added, placing her hand over his heart. "I no longer have to pretend to be someone else to prove my worth. I can just be me." Their lips met in a tender kiss, the autumn sun reflecting off the glass facades of the buildings around them. Buildings that had become witnesses to their story. A story about a woman who hid her name to find herself, and a man who had to learn to trust to find something more than just success. "So what's next?" Thomas asked as they broke apart. "Another project? Another challenge?" Alexandra smiled mysteriously. "I have an idea about converting an old factory in Detroit. Something that could bridge the past with the future. Something we could create together." "Together," he repeated, savoring the word. "That sounds perfect." Their hands clasped tighter as they walked through the courtyard. An architect and a CEO, a woman and a man, partners in every sense of the word. A new chapter stretched out before them, full of challenges, opportunities, and the shared creation of spaces that would last long after they were gone. Because buildings remain, and so does true love. What did you think of the story? Share your opinion in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What was your score? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to follow all our stories and have fun.